Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Scares That Shaped Us, a podcast about horror writers and the stories that made them. I'm your host, Matthew Jackson, and we've got a really good one for you this week. Christopher Golden is here. We're going to talk to Chris about his work, including his new novel, The Nightbirds, which is available right now. We're recording this on May 6th. It came out today, so everyone go get The Nightbirds. It's really fun. And we're finally going to talk about Stephen King on this show for the first time. Took us 8 months, but we are finally at our very first Stephen King release. We're going to talk about 1978's Night Shift. It's a really fun discussion about our early King reading experiences, King as a short story writer, and short fiction in the horror genre in general. I had so much fun talking to Chris. I hope that y'all have fun listening to it. I also want to plug really quickly before we get to our interview an appearance I had on another podcast. I was on the Certified Forgotten podcast. And if you don't know about Certified Forgotten, it's run by two great film critics and writers, Matt Donato and Matt Monagle. And they came up with a really cool premise for a show. They talk about films that have 10 reviews, horror films specifically, I should say. They talk about horror films that have 10 reviews or fewer on Rotten Tomatoes. And it is an opportunity to talk about some lesser known gems in the horror genre because they always have guests on who really want to champion specific films for specific reasons. I talked about a direct to video erotic vampire thriller from 1990 called Pale Blood, which I love. And if you want to know more about why I love it so much, you should go check out Certified Forgotten. Just go to certifiedforgotten.com and check out the podcast. They also have a lot of great writing up on that site from a lot of great writers. So Certified Forgotten, can't recommend that show and that website enough if you're a horror fan and you like checking out off the beaten path stuff. That does it for recommendations and plugs. For now, we will head over to our interview with the wonderful Christopher Golden. Joining us this week on The Scares That Shaped Us is one of the most prolific genre writers of the last 30 years in horror. His recent novels, just his recent novels, there are lots of them, include books like Road of Bones, All Hallows, The House of Last Resort, and now you can read his latest book, The Nightbirds, available everywhere books are sold, May 6th. Christopher Golden, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here, and I love your radio voice.
Oh, I try. I don't know how much it's a radio voice, but I do my best to talk our guests up, make it sound cool, make everybody go get these books. And speaking of which, I was so excited to get my hands on the Nightbirds. You were kind enough to facilitate getting me a copy, and it's a lot of fun. For listeners who maybe haven't read up on what this book is, could you give us a little teaser of what they can expect in the Nightbirds?
Yeah, I mean, I think The Nightbirds is a great example of one of the things I love to do when writing, which is to take two ideas that I have or two things I really want to write about and kind of crash them together and see what becomes of that. And I think that the books that people tend to like the best of mine are almost all born that way. And in this case, it was a combination of this. I'd run across this story about this freighter or two freighters, I can't remember now which, that's like a century old, that is sort of marooned off the shore in Australia. And basically it's all rotted out in the bottom and it's half sunken. And a mangrove forest has grown up through the inside of the freighter. And so you can still see it now. I mean, it's there. And I thought that was fascinating, but I wanted to set it in the US. A lot of my books are set around the world, but this one I wanted to keep local. And so it's set in Texas off the coast of Galveston instead. And then the other piece was this idea that I had about this couple who'd broken up, and we don't know why, 18 months ago, but we know that it was something really sad and dark. And he is approached by his ex in the parking lot in the middle of a tropical storm as he's about to go out to the ship where he's working as a botanist and ecologist. And she has with her this other woman and a baby. And they basically say, can you hide us? Can you keep us safe for a couple of days? They're on the run, and he doesn't know what they're on the run from. But we quickly learn that they're on the run from evil, and I don't think it's too much giving too much away to say that it involves a very specific kind of witches that I've invented, and and they want that baby, and it goes from there.
It is such a great, I mean, just the setting alone, the ship that you have in this novel, it's called the Christabel. Um, with a forest, floating forest growing up through it, as your protagonist Book calls it. His name is Book, by the way, everybody. Like, he goes by Book. I'm not just saying book like it's a
Yes.
novel. It's such a fascinating setting, and then you throw in the tropical storm and everything that allows for in horror. And I don't mind telling you, like, the first time one of your villains shows up in the text, I was genuinely uh very, very unsettled and had trouble going to sleep because I was imagining this being out in the rain moving in the way that you describe, and I'm deliberately avoiding describing what they're doing in the scene because it's just
Yeah.
so creepy and wonderful. um so like you said, you've set books around the world. Your last novel, House of Last Resort, was set in Italy. And now you're down here in, I'm a Texas guy, so I was excited to hear that it was set in Galveston. You could have picked a lot of coastal places to do this. Why was Galveston attractive for you?
So first confession, I've never been to Galveston.
Mm,
I read, since most of it takes place just off the coast, I didn't need to do a ton of research, but I
right.
did read a lot about the things that I needed to know to sort of get the tone of it, and of what his job would be. But I picked Galveston because for me, it has a certain mythic quality when it comes to storms, when it comes to hurricanes, even though this isn't a hurricane. Um, and so I don't know. I just love places that have that, um, this sort of mythic history that creates sort of its own legend. Obviously, it's a modern city. It's the 21st century. It's all of those things, but you don't have to do much more than close your eyes to sort of imagine the things about a place like Galveston. And um, I also felt like its history as a shipping port was really important to the sort of backstory of the ship. And I also wanted to place it someplace that was not familiar to me, that was not that didn't feel reliable to me, because it makes me sort of sit up and do my homework and make and pay attention.
Yeah, well, it is of all the coastal cities in Texas, Galveston has this deliberate, the residents of Galveston have sort of deliberately kept certain sort of old world qualities to it for the sake of tourism. And it's not exclusively a Galveston thing, but if you want a sort of spooky kind of throwback town, Galveston is a really great place to start. And obviously it has its natural disaster history as well. But I was just fascinated to be like, oh, it's a Texas novel from Massachusetts born and bred Christopher Golden. That's fun. Um, so,
I have been to Texas. I've just
oh
never
no,
been to
yeah,
Galveston. Yeah, yeah,
totally. It as a Texan, I was not offended that you were writing about Texas, nor did I think that you were writing about Texas in an unconvincing way.
yeah.
I think it all works. But you mentioned that you invented these witches, and
Right.
I don't want to give too much away about what exactly you invented. I want to ask you though, when you are building a sort of new horror mythology whole cloth like that,
Mhm.
obviously, like, if we hear the word witch, we as horror fans think of certain things, but you are playing with your own version of this. Was that, you said these were two ideas, was that the second idea, just kind of like, I have these unique witches that I want to play with? How did the witches come about?
So that whole thing actually just started with, and this is not necessarily giving things away because it unfolds in a way that will be surprising to people. But um, I'd had this idea about two women who belonged to a coven of witches um, one of whom is going to have a baby and who fall in love and run away to take care of the baby. That's not the story of the Nightbirds, but it is the idea that sort of collided with this other idea to create this book. And for me, look, I say this just really bluntly and not in any, intentionally self-deprecating way. I'm very happy with my career. I've had a lot of great successes, but I've never been under the microscope enough for people to pay that much attention to this pattern in my work. But anybody who has been reading me for a long time will know that um, I I spend a lot of time in so many of my books digging into the past and creating new histories for tropes. I'm almost never satisfied with the even my first novel is a vampire novel, but it's very unconventional, particularly at that time, vampire novel. And so I do that a lot. And with witches especially, um, witches are such it's tricky territory because, you don't want to trade on the horrible things that were done to women who were scapegoated and murdered in by people who called them witches to give themselves an excuse. So more than ever in this case, I wanted to make sure that I did that, but I do it anyway. I did it Rhoda Bones. I do it constantly because that's just the way my brain works. And in this case, it was just about um, focusing on this thing I do often, which is talk about the world before the world. Um, I do that in a lot of books where I talk about, before even history, but before prehistory, what was the world like then and what existed then. And it's a really fertile place to set your ancient mythology. So yeah, so I do that. Also, there's a real direct correlation between the Nightbirds and the mythology that I have invented along the way while Mike Mignola and I have been working on our Outerverse comic book universe. So there's a connection there too. So yeah.
I was going to ask about that because Mike is known as a guy who will take, loves folklore, loves reading about legends and folk tales, and will take a nugget from one of those folk tales. I love reading the back matter in Hellboy comics because it's always, well, I was reading this folk tale about this guy who lost his head at an old tavern, and I decided, well, what if Hellboy went there? And it's always fun. As someone who's worked with people like Mike a lot, as well as a lot of other artists in your comics writing career and illustrated novels and all that stuff, um, what do you get from your collaborators, just in a more general way that you keep feeding back into your solo work?
I mean, I think it depends. I think it differs person to person.
Hmm.
I think my collaborative relationship with Mike is probably the oldest one that I have, and we've worked together on more stuff. I mean, we've been working together since shortly after the first issue of Hellboy came out, really.
Hmm.
Um, so it's 30 years, I think, at this point, and or close to. But with Mike in particular, I think in a way, so I think the reason we've worked together for so long and that we work so well together is that there's this Venn diagram that you could overlap sort of my interests and passions and knowledge and his, and in that space where they meet is a lot of really interesting stuff. We have a lot of similar frame of reference and a lot of similar loves, but our approach is completely different. And I've learned a lot from him, particularly as a control freak. I mean, I think he probably is too, but from a different perspective. And one of the things that I've learned from him is to sort of let go and give myself the freedom to not answer every question, to let there be mystery in the larger sense, that sort of mystical sense of mystery. Um, and I think also we do things in reverse. So, for instance, Mike will read a bit of folklore and I love folklore as well, that he loves, and he'll um, invent a story that I think will give him that the flavor of that, will let him keep tasting that. Whereas usually I'll come up with an idea, and then I want to do something really interesting with that idea, and I'm like, okay, so what bits of folklore can I weave into this thing to make it really interesting to me, in hopes that, of course, then it will be really interesting to the people who are reading it. So it's a sort of opposite approach in a weird way, I think. But ask me tomorrow, the answer will be different.
Well, you talked about applying a different perspectives on tropes, and I think that is a great transition into the book we're going to talk about today. This is very exciting for me because when I started this podcast, about 8 months ago, and I said, "Tell me about the stories that formed you as writers." I was convinced like I'm gonna have all the Stephen King requests. Everyone's gonna want to talk about The Shining or this or that, and you are the first author to bring a Stephen King release to us. We're going to talk about 1978's Night Shift, which is King's first anthology, first collection of stories. And I know we usually talk about individual stories here, but we've talked about anthology films. And if we can talk about anthology films, we can talk about anthology books. So we're going to talk about Night Shift in all its glory. But first, before we hit record, Chris was saying that you actually said you have a theory as to why you're the first Stephen King guest on this show, and I thought it was just because there's a bunch of other King podcasts, but you had other thoughts, and I'm curious what
Yeah,
those
I
are.
think you had mentioned that a number of people have talked about Clive Barker, and I love Clive, and um, Clive definitely changed my trajectory. You know, he was like the asteroid that hits the planet that changes its orbit. And I think that's absolutely true for me. I mean, when I read Books of Blood, that was it. I was like, okay, now I understand a little bit more about what's possible here. Um, but I think people are tend, depending on the age of the people you're bringing in. But I think I'm 57, but I think that a number of people might just think everyone's going to choose King, or everyone's going to have a King story or a King novel that's going to be the thing. That what was it for them. But I started to think about the age where, this is about the scares that formed us, right? And um, I was thinking about the age where I started to become me, and become the writer that I am, and all of that stuff. And I just thought, okay, well, it was reading uh, anthologies edited by Charles L. Grant, novels by Stephen King, and I was thinking about various stories from those books. And then I thought, but really, the one that is an entire book of stories that have influenced me is Night Shift, the whole thing. So I think that I'm just I think other people may be skipping King because they think it's what everybody else is going to choose. But I just think, you know, I can't choose anything but this.
Yeah, well, it is also one of my strongest memories early of reading King. I think my first King novel was The Stand, which is a weird first King novel to choose because it's so massive and intimidating to especially I was like 15 when I read it, but Night Shift was the book that I was like, "Oh, this guy can do it all in one form or another." And we talk about this was something we were talking about, or I was talking about when his last anthology came out, where everyone was going, "Wow, Stephen King can still do this," and we were like, "Yeah, he's always done this. Every anthology is this crazy kaleidoscope of influence and style and trying all these different things." Um, so how old were you when you first read Night Shift? Do you remember?
I mean, probably 14, I'm going to
Yeah.
guess. What year did we say it was? 78?
It came out in 78, yeah.
All right. So, okay. So I was probably, because I was probably 13, because 78, I would have been 11 years old. So it was in paperback. So I was probably 13.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Um, was it what was your first King? Was this your first, or did you
You
have
know
other
what? I
stuff before?
honestly don't remember
Mm.
because the minute it might have been The Stand, which I bought. I remember buying it in an airport. My parents were taking my siblings and me down to Florida to visit my grandparents, and I bought it in the little bookstore in the airport. I still remember that so well, um, and it's still my favorite novel of all time.
Mm.
But in quick succession, I know that I read um, the Night Shift and Salem's Lot
Hmm.
and Carrie in quick succession at that point. So it was before the Dead Zone came out. It was so oh, and The Shining. So I
Mm.
again I don't remember exactly when, but it was right around that time.
Right.
Uh,
Okay. Now you mentioned The Stand, and we may talk about this a little bit at the end. You have a whole anthology co-edited with Brian King about The Stand coming out this summer.
yes.
Um, so knowing that The Stand is your favorite novel of all time, and that you have now built an entire massive release of new original stories from all these writers around The Stand, why did you pick Night Shift?
Because while The Stand is hugely influential, I don't think it really scared me that much.
Mm.
And also because I think again, Night Shift is this box of flavors. Night Shift is, it's the Forrest Gump box of chocolates. Um, what I love about this book so much is that every single story again had an impact on me, and I remember reading them. And I also think um, for people who don't understand how this worked, um, I think it's really helpful to go back and watch the Twilight Zone, like watch all the episodes of the Twilight Zone, and read, short stories by Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson and those folks, and then read Night Shift, and then read stuff that came after Night Shift. And I think what we see is that Night Shift is sort of the crossroads between, because it's heavily influenced by the kind of stuff that came before it. There are a lot of Twilight Zone feeling elements to the stories in this particular collection, but it's also horror stories that are harder than anything that Serling would have put on Twilight Zone. And so the flavor of all of that stuff is in here, and so I just love it because I think it's a milestone, along the road, and I think it changed things.
It absolutely feels that way. King has talked a lot about the influence of particularly Matheson on his stuff, but also like writers like Arthur Machen and Robert Bloch. And Bloch and Matheson in particular, you can really feel in these stories.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in part because so many of them, if listeners don't know, these were stories that he sold before he was a published novelist to magazines at the time, and a lot of them were men's magazines.
Yeah, which was a polite euphemism for porn magazines. I
Yes,
mean,
yes,
they
yes.
used
They
to
were
call them
they
all
were
kinds of things, girly magazines, whatever. It was Gallery and We and a bunch of other things from that era. Cavalier was another one.
Cavalier,
Yeah, yeah,
Adam, stuff like that. Yeah. So, and he had not yet been published in stuff like Playboy. He wasn't big enough for
right.
Playboy. He was selling to, and basically, it was if you go back and read the things that he has written about this time in his life, it was very much like this is the $200 that we're going to need that are it's going to keep the car running for another month. This is the
Exactly.
money we need to buy antibiotics when our kids are sick. This was their just scraping by money that he was making on the side writing these stories. And so they are very sort of mercenary in that way, which as a freelance writer I can relate to, that he was just sort of chasing like what is a good set them up, knock them down kind of chiller story that I can send to a fiction editor at a men's magazine who will say, "Oh, that's really gnarly and fun. Okay, we'll publish this." But at the same time, there is so much thoughtfulness in them, and we'll get into the individual stories in a minute. But just overall, it is a remarkably well formed sort of variety pack of an imagination.
Right.
It's just so um he obviously didn't write these stories thinking, and one day I'm going to put them all in one book and they're going to be arranged in this order and this is how they're going to make maximum
Exactly.
impact. It was just like, what can I sell this week?
Yeah,
Guy drinks too much beer and turns into a brain monster. Okay.
exactly.
Uh,
Turns into a beer monster,
a beer
which,
monster.
with a history of alcoholism in the family, I understood completely. And again, these are the things, right? Every single story in the book feels like it has a flourish. It has like a. I tell people when I'm talking about when I talk to other writers, I say with a short story, and I was not a good short story writer for a long time, and I think I've gotten better at it over the years. But I think with a good short story, you should feel like you want to say "ta-da" at the end. And I feel like all of these have that sort of a stage magician flourish to them. And I think you're right about, he was trying to sell these stories because he needed to. It wasn't like somebody said, "Hey, I will buy a story from you. Send me something." It was, I need to send in something that will get them to buy it. And you're right. I think that's in all of these.
So when I first read Night Shift, it was probably about 2001, 2002. So it had been out, it was already a very influential story collection. But the reason that I bought it was I was just getting into Stephen King, and all my friends in high school knew Stephen King from movies, which I was also still catching up on because I didn't read horror when I was very young. And the one, for whatever reason, that stuck out that everyone at school was talking about was Children of the Corn.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about the movie, but I had to go. I was like, okay, what is Children of the Corn? It's such a cool title. I got to know what this is. And I went home and I looked up, like, where do you read Children of the Corn? Oh, it's in this book called Night Shift. So when I bought my copy of Night Shift, I immediately went home, found Children of Corn in the table of contents, opened to that, read that, went, whoa, that's creepy, and then just kind of skipped around. And I did not read it in order. What was your? Do you remember just going straight through it, start to finish, when you first read
Oh,
it? Or do you?
absolutely. I mean, I read, again, I don't even have to look at this so I read it beginning with the introduction or foreword that he wrote. Actually, no, John D. MacDonald, I think,
John
wrote
D.
the
McDonald.
foreword. Yep.
Yeah,
But then King wrote an introduction. And in that he talked about, and again, I haven't looked at it in years, many years, but pardon me, he talked about, even when I go to bed at night and I know that there's nothing under my bed, but I still am at pains to make sure that my legs are beneath the covers, and just in case a hand should reach up and grab me by the ankle or whatever. I still remember that
yeah.
so well. Just reading that, I'm getting a chill remembering reading that. So, and at that point I went through story by story and I just like opening it up, right? So he wrote the foreword, and weirdly, like, okay, so it begins with the most off-putting. If you are somebody who is is not somebody who reads a lot of occult fiction, or who has read Lovecraft or Poe, if you haven't read any of that stuff, if you haven't read Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto or whatever, and you start with Jerusalem's Lot, for a lot of young readers, that would be really off-putting. But
Yeah.
fortunately, I read some Poe and stuff like that, and I was totally into it. Um, and it's a fascinating story, but it's not the kind of thing that, if I were the editor, I would probably have said maybe don't open with that story.
Right. Yeah.
Um, but
It's
but anyway, it's great also because it is that bookend of Salem's Lot. It's the history or a history of Salem's Lot, which made me surprised that the last story in the book is the woman in the room,
and
instead
not
of,
one for the road.
and
Yeah.
not One for the Road, which comes right before the woman in the room. And One for the Road is an epilogue to Salem's Lot. So you have a prologue and epilogue to Salem's Lot, but you don't end with the epilogue, which I thought was really interesting. One for the Road, by the way, one of my favorite King short stories ever, and also one that gives me the chills because you get to the end and the last line is chilling.
Yes, there are so many great last lines like even the stories that I don't love as much as others, like stuff like Strawberry Spring and The Woman in the Room and stories like that. I don't love them as much, but they still have these amazing stingers at the very end. Um and you met
But
yeah,
you can go through all of these stories, and just there's so much. Yes, I mean there's a lot of pulp fiction in this
yeah.
book, no question. But even the pulp, look at Trucks, which became Maximum Overdrive, the movie that King directed. Um, Trucks absolutely should not work. It should not work at all, but it absolutely works, and it's because of the writing. It's unsettling as hell because it's so well written, and it is a pulp fiction story.
Yeah.
But then you read I Know What You Need. You remember that one?
Yeah.
I Know What You Need is the creepy boyfriend who's like, you know, trying to change everything about. And, anyway, I just don't want to, but it's a very different, more sophisticated, unsettling story. Anyway, we could go through them all, and I will also cop to. I wrote a novel years ago called "The Boys Are Back in Town," which was inspired by Sometimes They Come Back.
Oh yeah. Sometimes They Come Back is such a wonderful you mentioned Trucks, and Trucks is like it's a story about sentient trucks that are trying to
Mm-hmm.
kill humans, and it takes place at a truck stop that's under siege, but it works so well as this almost like Night of the Living Dead kind of riff. My favorite story in the collection, um which I differentiate. I don't think it's the best story in the collection necessarily on
Yeah.
a craft level, but my favorite is Battleground. And Battleground, if you explain to someone who's never read it, like what's going on in Battleground, they'll be like, "That sounds so silly."
Right.
But read it because it's about a hitman who comes home after doing a job. He's killed someone, and he has a package waiting for him. And he goes up to his apartment and he opens the package, and it turns out to be sentient army men who then try to kill him because he killed a relative of a toy manufacturer who has now crafted these sentient army men that are going to
Yeah.
kill
Well,
hitmen.
it's some kind of like hex or magical spell that's been put on a box of a little foot locker of plastic, let's say plastic army men with their
Yes.
plastic weapons and tanks, that you could order from the back page of comic books in the 60s. um, but in this case they've had a spell put on them that brought them to life, and they've been ordered to murder him.
Yes.
And as you're right, like Trucks, for most writers would be completely incapable of making that idea really work, but it really works. It sings completely, and it's not, uh, yeah. It's also interesting to me because so often you see something like Graveyard Shift, the story in here, which was made into a film starring Brad Dourif, and the film is okay, but the thing about Graveyard Shift is that um, it's it's really creepy, it's really gross, it's really unsettling, it's very Lovecraftian in some ways, as a number of these stories are. Um, but uh, it has this element of it has a high bar for achievement, I think, right? And this is why when you make a movie, so many people will read some of these stories and think, if I'm going to make a movie of this, I've got to make it something more than it is. And by trying to do something, instead of trying to figure out why it works on the page and try to replicate whatever makes it work on the page, so often they just try to figure out, well, it's not going to work as a movie like it is, so I need to quote unquote fix it. And I think that is always the stumbling block, right? Um, yeah,
Well,
but I'm just
this is one of the most this may be the most adapted book published in the
oh
last
yeah,
like 50 years, because almost every story in this anthology has been adapted as a standalone feature film or part of an anthology somewhere. Like Battleground was in the Nightmares and Dreamscapes TV show.
Yep.
Gray Matter was on Creep Show, the TV show. Quitters Inc. and The Ledge were both
Part of Cat's Eye.
Cat's Eye. Yeah, I was gonna say Quicksilver Highway, but that's not right. It's Cat's
No.
Eye. Yeah.
But then the Boogeyman has been adapted, I think, twice.
Yes.
But the story is amazing.
Yes. The story that is one. In terms of endings, I thought about the ending of the Boogeyman for so long because there is so little detail in the story about exactly what the Boogeyman is and what it looks like.
Yeah.
But the reveal at the end that the Boogeyman has been in the room the whole time, and he just sort of says that it's holding a human mask in one clawed hand, and I could not stop thinking about what that would look like.
Yeah.
And we should also mention, like, this is a kaleidoscope of great horror stuff. You have possessed objects, you have magic, you have occult fiction, you have the throwback.
I Am the Doorway, which is
Oh,
an amazing story.
you want to talk about?
Been adapted?
I don't think so, but I don't know. I think someone's
I
dollar
Am the
baby did
Doorway
at least, but
is
if you want
cosmic sci-fi horror about an astronaut who has eyeballs beginning to grow inside his hands.
yes,
and they're sentient as well and malignant, malicious.
Yeah.
I should say.
One of the best single. I mean, there's a reason that image was used as the cover for the paperback, because it is one of the most icky. It makes you squirm just thinking about it. The idea that there are eyeballs growing out of your hands. It's such a great piece of sci-fi horror. But there's also like just basic straight up suspense fiction in here with no supernatural elements. The Ledge.
Last Rung on the Ladder.
Yeah, The Last Rung on the Ladder. The Ledge was in Cat's Eye, I think, and that's about a crime boss who makes a guy walk around a ledge on the top of a hotel to try and survive. It's just a great like survival horror story.
It's a great story. I wouldn't even say it's a horror story. It's a great suspense story. But I would have to say, completely, I don't know if am I allowed to swear on this?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Let it fly.
Completely fucked up, because it's the only way you could say it. Quitters Inc. is completely fucked up. Great story, which is, for those who haven't read it, and we haven't really even talked about the plots of a lot of these stories, but you really need to. Quitters Inc. is a story about a guy who really wants to quit smoking. And he meets another guy who did quit smoking. And he gives him the business card of this company called Quitters Incorporated. And basically you go in and you sign this piece of paper and you agree to these various things. And basically they're watching you at all times. And if you smoke, they punish you. And for instance, they'll take him and they'll put him in a room, and the room has an electrified floor, and they'll shock him. And the next time he smokes, they do it to his wife instead. And it goes from there. And it's just, it's a great, mean-spirited, just a terrific story. And again, so you're right. It is this box of chocolates. It's this kaleidoscope of just different. You're right. All different flavors of horror are represented.
So I mentioned my favorite story. Do you have a single favorite from this collection that you want to single out?
I mean, it is so hard. There are so many great stories in here. The Boogeyman is definitely one of them. I'm glad you mentioned Battleground. Trucks is amazing. We didn't even mention the Lawnmower Man, which is the weirdest, like, that's the Arthur Machen or Machen.
Yeah, that is
right there.
Absolutely, like it. It's funny because when I first read The Lawnmower Man, which there is a movie called The Lawnmower Man, it has no relationship
nothing to do
to the point that
it is based on the story, but it's got nothing to do with the story.
To the point that King sued to get his name taken off the posters and stuff, because it was very clear that they had just lifted a title
Yeah.
and put a guy with a lawnmower in a movie. But yeah, the Lawnmower Man is about a guy hires someone to mow his lawn, and this guy has a very unusual way of mowing lawns, and uh may also be a sort of forest spirit, or a nymph, or a satyr. He may be a satyr, which I didn't even catch the first time I read the story when I was a teenager. I was reading it and I was like, oh, this is just about a fucked up guy who like kills people with a lawnmower. But no, there is
Yeah.
something like
No,
weirdly.
he's definitely some kind of out of work forest spirit. Yes.
Yes, yes. There is this weird Arthur Machen almost fairy story element to it that's so great. There's also, we talked about Jerusalem's Lot is a prequel to Salem's Lot. One for the Road is a an
So
epilogue to Salem's
yeah,
Lot.
that's my answer actually. I
One
think
for the
One for
Road.
the Road is my favorite story in the book. I think because honestly, um, I was talking about this recently, and I'll just quickly say, so I think my horror roots go back to birth, basically. But when it really took off, I think I was 7 years old, watching the original Frankenstein, and he throws the little girl in the pond, and then the next scene, you see him carrying her dead body through the town, and everybody's freaking out and screaming in grief and horror, and his face is so wretched with despair because he needs help. He doesn't know what happened, and he wants them to help him. And the complicated emotional basis of that scene, I think, is what made me love horror, and even at 7. And so for me, One for the Road wins the prize for this, because of the two guys and the humanity and the open hearts that they have. That basically it's about this guy who stumbles in. It's the middle of a snowstorm. Salem's Lot has been closed down for years, and it's been a blizzard, and everybody is sort of sitting inside this cafe. And this guy comes in needing help. He has abandoned his wife and child, his wife and daughter, in the car, and he needs somebody to go back with him. So one of the guys has a plow. They go back to rescue the wife and daughter, but nobody is in the car, because they've left their car near the abandoned town of Salem's Lot in this blizzard. And of course, we all know what happened in Salem's Lot. And the humanity that is present in so much of what King writes in a lot of these stories, Trucks comes back to me. Trucks works because of the humanity of the characters, and the humanity of the two guys who go out to help these people in need, and the sadness and chill of the very, very last bit of the story. Um, Man, it's just so. I talked about the flourish, but it's no magic trick is effective unless the setup is equal to the flourish, right? And this story is the best magic trick for me in the book.
It is such a wonderful, and it's one of the most, if not the most, understated stories in this collection. It's so quiet,
So quiet.
which if you've read Salem's Lot, and you know how that novel just builds and builds and builds and builds and builds to this big crescendo. It's such an interesting, it's a great companion piece to the prologue of Salem's Lot too, which is itself set in the near future of that book, and you learn a little bit about what happens to the main characters. But it is very much that feeling of, it reminded me of the Vertilac, the story. Forget who wrote the original story now. But it reminds me of that scene in Mario Bava's Black Sabbath, where it's everyone is just sort of talking about the monster and what's going to happen when the monster shows up, and you only get these little hints because it's about these guys and the relationship they have with this very particular fear that has crept into their daily lives. And it reminds, I'm so glad that you mentioned the bit about the bed covers in the introduction, because that still is one of my favorite Stephen King observations ever, when he talks about when I go to bed at night, I make sure to keep my feet under the covers so a cold hand won't come out and grab my ankle. And then he adds to that, like, I'm a reasonable man. I know that there is nothing under the bed to grab
Right.
my ankle, but I also know that if I keep my feet covered,
Right.
it can't grab me.
You can't get me. Yeah.
And
I'm an adult. I know it's not there, but as long as I keep my feet under the covers, it can't get me. Yeah.
that is such a great insight into the way that he writes about human characters going through horrific situations. And it's even there in which we already talked about. Gray Matter is about a little boy who has to go to the store to get beer for his dad, and his dad is sick. And he's talking about his dad being sick and is sort of alluding to physical weirdness that started to happen, but he doesn't really want to tell these other adults at the store exactly what's going on. And but then it becomes clear that these adults need to intervene on behalf of this poor kid. And they go to the house and they find that the dad has turned into this awful, monstrous being.
Yeah. It's not just because the setup of the story is, of course, that everybody in the town knows the father is an absolute raging alcoholic.
Yeah.
So he won't get up out of his chair, and he sends his son to get his beer for him because he just can't even get up because he's drunk all the time. But it obviously then it turns out there's a lot more to it than that, because there's something bad in his beer.
Right. Well, and it is a creature story. It's a monster story, and the metaphor is so obvious and so, like, King himself is a recovering alcoholic, and I am too. Like it, but you don't have to be one to see how clear the stamp is there. Like, oh, this guy drinks so much beer that he can't get up, so he turned into a literal monster.
Right.
But what makes the story work are those conversations that those other men in the town have to have with this little boy about, like, hey, what's really going on? You can tell us, like, be open up about it. Children of the Corn works because, yeah, there are homicidal, creepy kids who worship a corn deity, but it's about this couple that is trying to keep themselves together in the midst of this awful situation. And, like, we're far from the first people to talk about the humanity of Stephen King characters, but it's so wonderful to look at these stories. And these were published, some of them go back to 1969, which is Night Surf was published in 1969, which Night Surf is a companion piece to The Stand.
Right.
It's a Captain Tripp story, years before The Stand was ever published. So these are going back so far to well before he was a published novelist, and it's already all there, and it's all so clear. I don't know what else to say. It's just such a great, it may be my favorite single author anthology ever, or collection ever. It's so good.
Yeah. Yeah. No, honestly, it's funny because I think about that too. And it is, it is hard to have something that is so consistently great as a collection. And in horror, certainly, to my mind, um, Shirley Jackson, Tales of the Demon Lover, um, Barker's Books of Blood, the first 3 volumes. The other 3 volumes are great, but the first 3 volumes are definitely better and amazing. Joe Hill's 20th Century Ghosts, amazing collection.
Joe Hill's 20th Century. This is not a Joe Hill podcast, but if anyone ever wants to come talk about 20th Century Ghosts, the first story in that anthology, Best New Horror, is still one of the most blow you through the back wall of whatever room you're in things I've ever read. It's brilliant.
Well, I will tell you a funny story. I wrote the introduction to 20th Century Ghosts prior to knowing that Joe was born Joe King. I knew him, but I knew him as Joe Hill. And that the original version of that story talks about a panel at this horror convention. And in the original text of that story, I was on that panel. And I didn't know that, of course, until I read the story. And after I read the story, I asked Joe to remove me from the story because I thought it would look self-serving for me to write the introduction to the book if I show up in this story. And of course, I've regretted it ever since, because I thought now millions of people have read this book. I wish that I had left my name in it. But in any case,
I will add if we're making a list of the best single author collections ever, I have to add Stephen Graham Jones's After the People Lights Have Gone Off.
I've read a lot of Stephen stuff, but I've not read that collection. I should do it.
It just got reprinted along with several of his other early things. The one I feel like The Ones Who Got Away, which is his other big collection, is the one that gets more notice because it has Father, Son, Holy Rabbit, which is maybe the most famous Stephen Graham Jones short story. But After the People Lights Have Gone Off has so many wonderful things, including what for me is the scariest short story he's ever written. It's called Welcome to the Reptile House. But anyway, speaking of,
I'll definitely look it up in that, but I have one more recommendation that is much more likely to have gone unnoticed for many people who are listening to this.
Yes.
If you have not read Remember Why You Fear Me by Robert Shearman, I promise you, you will email me later after you read it.
All right.
And Rob is one of the best writers literally alive, I believe, and one of the best readers of his stories alive. And the brilliance in Remember Why You Fear Me is staggering. He's so good, but that collection, amazing. Trust me.
I just wrote it down. I'm gonna go find it immediately after this. But before we let you go, I want to, speaking of short story collections, you and Brian King this August, Brian Keene, not King, Keene, Keene.
Yeah.
Brian Keene, the great Brian Keene, and Chris are releasing The End of the World as We Know It, New Tales from Stephen King's The Stand, New Tales of Stephen King's The Stand, I should say. A massive new anthology with original stories set in the world of The Stand by a true murderer's row of incredible writers. Like, I'm just going to give you a few names here, everybody. Poppy Z. Bright, which Poppy Z. Bright's Wormwood is also a great short story collection that everyone should read. Robert Cargill, Nat Cassidy, V. Castro, S.A. Cosby, Tananarive Due, Gabino Iglesias, Sarah Langan, Joe Lansdale, Josh Mallerman, Ronald Malfi, Bev Vincent, Chuck Wendig, and the list goes on. Paul Tremblay, if you want to talk about followers of Stephen King, Paul Tremblay is a great one. How did this anthology come together? Was it always envisioned as something like we're going to do a book about The Stand that's as big as The Stand? How did you and Brian start putting this together?
I mean, the thing is, so firstly, I would say this. My only regret with this book is that it couldn't be twice as big, because there are so many writers that I would have wanted to include that we just didn't have the space to include everybody. And of course, almost nobody said no. Usually you ask, but then you can supplement, you can slot people in, right? But anyway, so that's my one regret. But basically, Brian and I had done an anthology sort of dedication to Joe Lansdale's seminal novel, The Drive-In, which is a hugely influential book. And I have edited a lot of anthologies, and I had at a certain point decided I wasn't going to do it anymore. Even though I enjoy it, it's a lot of work for very little compensation, typically. And I had said that prior to doing the Drive-In book, and then we had done the Drive-In book, and I don't know what happened. I was sitting here one day, and I was like, God, it would be amazing to do this. I'm sure he'll say no, but it would be so cool to do it. So I called Brian, and I said, look, we just did this Drive-In one. I'm going to email Steve and ask him if he'd go for this. And Brian said, he'll never say yes. And I said, well, he'll never say yes if we don't ask him. So I emailed him, just sort of explaining what we wanted to do. And the email reply came back not pretty quickly. And it was 2 words: do it. And I couldn't believe it. I was blown away. He's in no hurry to have anybody ever do anything like this again.
Yeah.
Uh, However, he really is proud of the book from all reports, and really loved it. We got a bunch of emails from him during the process while he was reading the stories. We would get emails from him about various stories, and he really enjoyed it. But yes, so basically there were 34 stories. Two of them are collaborations, so there were 36 authors, 34 stories. It's absolutely massive. Um, and it takes place throughout the breadth of the events of the stand and long after the events as well. And I don't know, what else do you want to know. I mean, it was a highlight. Again, it's my favorite novel of all time. Brian's as well. Brian and I are exactly the same age, so it had the same impact, hit us at the same time. um you know
Everyone just sit and soak in the vicarious feeling that I'm having right now, which is that the very thought of getting an email from Stephen King that just says "do it." Um, I think that's an email that a lot of us would dream of getting, and it is a mammoth anthology. And I'm hoping that you and Brian will come on the show and talk about it with me later this summer,
yeah,
because
yeah, we would love to do that.
I
We'd
really
love to
want
do
to
that. It's
unpack.
really such a, I always talk about the fact that professionally, I think, you're split in two. There's the professional side of me, and the it sounds pretentious to say, but the artist side of me, and all of that. But there's also the kid that is the reason I am who I am now, and the reason I do the things I do now. And this book, this anthology, is the perfect union of those two pieces of me, right? And so I'm proud of it. I'm so excited to share it. I can't wait to talk more about it. But the stories, there are stories in there that are going to just knock you on your ass. And I will say that we were especially proud. I knew. I said, you know what? This is going to get Billy Martin to write again. This is going to get a new Poppy Z. Bright story out in the world. And indeed, because Billy, loves Stephen King, and so I emailed, and I was like, Billy, I know you haven't written fiction since Hurricane Katrina. However, we're doing this book, and I really want you to write a story. And he replied, and he said yes, and it was the first piece of fiction. So we're very proud to have inspired Billy to go back to create new Poppy Z. Bright stories.
That is Billy is one of those authors, as Poppy writing as Poppy Z Bright, that when I talk to people about like what are the authors that I should be reading after I've read all the Stephen King, I've read all the Dean Koontz, I've read all the Clive Barker. Where do I go after this? And I'm like, well, if you like Clive Barker and you like Stephen King and you want something a little more gothic, a little more strange, Poppy Z Bright is the place to go. Those stories are wonderful, and I can't wait to read what they cooked up for this. That book is called The End of the World as We Know It: New Tales of Stephen King's The Stand. It is out August 19th. The new novel from Chris is called The Nightbirds. If you're listening to this, it is out right now. It came out on May 6th, so go pick it up. It's wonderful. Chris, before we let you go, can you let everyone know what you have coming up to promote The Nightbirds and where they can find you online?
Well, I am signing on May 6th at Gibbs. Well, this will have missed it at Gibson's Bookstore in Concord, New Hampshire, and on the 8th at An Unlikely Story in Plainville, Massachusetts. I have other things coming up. I'll be, I'm trying to remember what the events are. I should think about this, and I'll be at Doylestown Books for something pretty soon. I'm trying to remember what else. Um,
This will
anyway.
all you'll be posting about it though, right? So
Yes, I will
everybody,
be posting. People can find me on Blue Sky and Facebook and Instagram, and also I'll announce it here. It hasn't been announced yet, but Tim Levin and I are doing a tour of the UK this fall to support my novel, The Nightbirds, The End of the World as We Know It, and Tim's new novel, Secret Lives of the Dead. So you can find us on the road in the UK this fall.
excellent. Our guest has been Christopher Golden. Chris, this was so much fun. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Matthew. It was great.
Thanks once again to Christopher Golden for being on the show. Again, The Nightbirds is out right now. If you haven't picked it up yet, go get it. It's a really fun novel. If you like Chris's stuff, it's right in there with the best of his work so far. I had a ton of fun with it, and I think you will too. And be sure to go follow Chris on socials to see all the stuff he has coming up as he's promoting The Nightbirds over the next few weeks. And of course, be sure to follow us on socials if you want to keep track of everything we have going on. We are mostly posting on Blue Sky. We are at scareshapedus.bsky.social over there if you want to go give us a follow. That is where you will find out about new guest announcements and new episodes and all the other stuff we have going on. You can also find us on Facebook. We're The Scares That Shaped Us over there on Facebook. We're also on YouTube. The Scares That Shaped Us over there. If that's how you prefer to get your podcast, go ahead and smash those like and subscribe buttons. We appreciate you. And if you want to email us, if you have a question, a comment, something you'd like to hear me talk about on the show, you can email scaresthatshapeduspodcast@gmail.com. Always happy to hear from everybody. That does it for us this week. We will be back next week, May 14th, with a brand new episode. Our guest will be Caitlin Starling, who wrote one of my favorite genre novels of the year so far, a horror fantasy extravaganza called The Starving Saints. We're going to talk to Caitlin about The Starving Saints, and we're going to talk about one of the most visually stunning horror films of the past 25 years, Tarsem Singh's The Cell. That was a really fun chat. We got into a lot of cool little digressions in there. Caitlin is awesome. You should all be pre-ordering The Starving Saints, and you should all be marking your calendars for this chat. That will drop May 14th at noon Central. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. I'm Matthew Jackson, and this is The Scares That Shaped Us.